Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Um, the first time that my husband and I met with fellow practitioners was in Uganda in 2007. And the keynote that we shared was based on the Jubilee texts. So the Jubilee texts, for those of you who are new to them, are found in Deuteronomy 15, Leviticus 25, the sweeping poetry that we see in Isaiah 61, and pulled all the way through by Jesus himself in Luke's fourth gospel. These are the texts that give us a really good picture of Jubilee. And so this was where my husband and I started in our theological exploration of community development. We were on the front end. We hadn't yet got deep in the work, but we were already doing the theological work to try and underpin our soon-to-be practice. And so, as we talked about Jubilee, our first foray into these texts, it's important to know that my husband is Burundian, born and raised in Burundi, which is a tiny country in the heart of Africa, typically slated as one of the poorest or most underdeveloped countries in the world. Matter of fact, this year, they were slated at the very bottom. And so he grew up in extreme poverty, that less than $1 a day kind of poverty. His dad was a United Methodist, or not a Free Methodist pastor and church planter, most often paid in chickens and mangoes, not money. And that is how he had to support his 13 kids. I, on the other hand, am a California girl. I was raised in Southern California and had all the luxuries that an upper middle class life offered. So we were reading the texts from very different social locations, you might say. And so the Jubilee texts talk about, actually it's economic policy. That's what it is, a concrete economic policy. Amazing that this was one of the first things that Jesus talked about in the public square, but that's a conversation for another time. But as we explored these Jubilee texts, it became clear, right, that the text talks about every 7 years there should be some kind of economic relief. But every 50 years was the big celebration. And what that meant was that on the 50th year, land was redistributed to original owners, debts were forgiven, people who were enslaved as part of their payback to their landlords were set free. It was a huge societal shift in the 50th year that had to do with land and labor and liberty, freedom. And I remember that as we would study these together, my husband said, wow, there is nothing that would be better news for my dad than to hear that his debts were forgiven, the big ones and the small ones. If somebody had stood up in the church and said, your debts are going to be forgiven, that is good news. Jesus knew what he was talking about. Now, I came from a different place in the social order. And I said, wow, my parents are the parents who own their own property. My parents owned other properties that they rented or that they flipped. Speculation was big in the 70s and 80s. My family would be the kind of family that would have to give back a land deed, would have to forgive debts and know that that money would never be repaid. Wow, that's hard news for my family. And so very quickly we learned Jubilee is both good news and hard news. And it really depended where you were as to how your family would have interpreted those words of Jesus. And in fact, when Jesus said them, when he pulled the Isaiah scroll out in Nazareth that day and he read this beautiful Jubilee text, the poor people who were listening would have been like, yes. But we see that later, when he was pulled aside and chatted with some of the Pharisees, who would have been more like me, upper class religious folks, they wanted to push him off a cliff. So these are really beautiful but challenging text. But this is where we began our journey. And one of the things that my husband loved from the first is that after Jesus reads this text in the synagogue, he puts it down and he looks at everybody and he says, today, this is going to happen. Today, this is going to begin. It's as if Jesus was announcing his campaign, and it was a Jubilee campaign, right? I mean, right now we hear all about campaigns, whether it's at state level or the federal level, but it's like Jesus said, my campaign is a Jubilee campaign. And it's going to start today. And for my husband, that really started him thinking, wow, things should start changing in Burundi. Like, he was raised by his pastor father to think about salvation as being a ticket to a better place in the afterlife. It's hard here. There's poverty, malnourishment, AIDS was ravaging the country at the time. Civil war was ravaging the country. But if we follow Jesus, if we accept Jesus, in a sense, we have an evacuation plan. We have the promise of heaven. But my husband read this text and said, Jesus said that this should start happening now. Jesus doesn't have an evacuation plan. Jesus has a transformation plan, that we are going to transform the very landscape we live in today. And that to him was so energizing. So this was our theological point of origin as it comes to development work. Now, what grew out of this conversation in Uganda was our eventual move back to Burundi. We had started our marriage in California, but now we were going to be back in Burundi, starting development work. And for the next 12 plus years, we would dedicate our life to this work. And that has included education and economics, healthcare, food security, human rights advocacy. I would take up too much time if I told you everything. What I learned right off is that my husband is quite an amazing practitioner. He is the fullest version of himself in Burundi. And boy, you love it when you see it. So the way that we often frame it, if you meet us, is I'm the book smart and he's the street smart. I'm the theologian, he's the practitioner. And so we work these texts and this life together, where I'm always looking at how does the text inform best practices? And he's always looking at the reality on the ground and saying, well, how does that challenge how we understand the text and kind of complicate how we come to these biblical texts? So it is really, it's been a really beautiful part of the work to be doing both the thinking and the practitioner things together over these last 12 years. But let me tell you a few stories. So again, my husband's name is Claude. He's the Burundian. So I will just now refer to him as Claude and trust that you are tracking with me. So about a couple years into our work in Burundi, my husband had the opportunity to start a bank. World Vision had a microlending. They had a microlending program, and they were having some challenges with it. And so the end of the story is just that they gifted it to my husband and said, if you could kind of make this work, we'll just give you the certificate so you can kind of keep working the microfinance end of things. And so he took that and created a hybrid model, got it approved through the central bank in Burundi. It took about a year, but he opened up a real bank. And this bank was focused on the 97% of Burundians that are typically unbanked. People like his dad who never had a bank account their whole life because they never had enough money to open an account or to pay monthly fees on an account. But he opened a bank that focused on how do we help the people at the bottom of the pyramid get into the economy. How do I identify the business people, the people who can create jobs and services for their neighbors, and support them with more capital and just more infrastructure so that they can create jobs. Burundi has at the time, it was over 40% unemployment. And so my husband's like, I'm going to cut that in half because he's quite ambitious. He's ambitious for the sake of justice. So I'll allow it. But we started this bank, and it's called Kazoza. Now, in Kirundi, the native language in Burundi, Kazoza means good future. And that's what we believed, that if we could come alongside with economic support, we could help families move into a good future, that we could help neighborhoods move into a good future. So we are maybe 6 or 7 months into our first year. We have a couple of hundred people who are banking with us. And it's a Sunday morning, and his phone starts going off. And then his second phone starts going off. And then his third phone starts going off, because he really did have 3 phones. Well, there was a fire in the marketplace. The marketplace is the central, it's the economic hub in Burundi. And Sunday morning, fire. The good news is that most people were in church, so there wasn't a lot of, there was minimal loss of life. But within 5 hours, the marketplace was gone. And that meant all those businesses, all those livelihoods were gone. Now, you know, about 78% of our clients did their business in the marketplace. So Sunday night, we knew most of them would never be able to repay their loans. We also knew that we probably would have to close our doors, because we were a young financial institution that just learned that about 78% of our people were not going to be able to repay their loans. It was a hard night. The next morning, my husband goes into the branch, and at the gate, there are about 40 women. They are distraught. Opens the gate, and he lets them come into the back patio. We have a big covered patio where we do a lot of meetings. The women sit, and they start to share what they've lost. And one of them kind of articulated for the sake of the group, you know, on Saturday night, I went to bed as a businesswoman. I had a kiosk. I had inventory in the marketplace. I had a loan from the bank. Woo, I could pay school fees next week for my kids. But by Sunday night, I went to bed poor again, because all of it was gone. And so Claude heard the women tell this story over and over, crying and weeping for the next set of hours. He had his staff like bring in Fantas, and then a little later bring in some donuts, because the women weren't done weeping and telling their stories, and more women kept coming and joining them. And this was pretty much the entire morning. Another time, a couple years later, there was a flood. Overnight, heavy rains, and washed away. There was a huge mudslide, and it washed away a whole hillside and all the neighborhoods on it. And it came so fast and so furious in the middle of the night that the water rushed these homes into Lake Tanganyika, which is the big lake that Burundi sits on the edge of. And then women, you know, would tell Claude the next day, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. These people went to bed with their families and their homes, and they woke up the next day with nothing. And Claude woke up in the morning, heard the news, and drove out to the neighborhoods. The Red Cross was already setting up a camp for the displaced families. And so he went into the camp and was immediately attracted to a group of women. While they were putting up the tents and the latrines, he went over and sat with the women. And again, they were sharing, you know, man, we went to bed. Everything was normal. And in the middle of the night, there was this rushing sound, and everything was moving and shaking. And the water was moving so quick and fast that it actually made the mattresses flotation devices. And a lot of them shared that their little kids that were on the bed with them got pushed out on mattresses into the water, gone. And so these women were mourning the loss of children, the loss of their home, the loss of their neighborhood. And he just sat with them, again, for hours that morning, just listening to them, weeping with them. He got in his car and drove back 30 minutes into the city. And he told me later, he says, I was just asking God, what do I do? I mean, this isn't our work. This isn't our community. What am I supposed to do? He just wept his whole way back to town. He gets into the office, and within a couple of minutes, there's a phone call, and it's the director of the Red Cross. And he asks Claude, we are desperate. We need more help. Any way that you and your team of people could set up another camp next to ours, we'll teach you how to do it, but we need more help. And so there was an answer, right? All of a sudden, we were part of the emergency relief crew alongside the Red Cross. We have I'm going to give you a third story. We have a large community, 660 families when we started. Now, not 660 people, but families. And in Burundi, families are anywhere from 8 to 10 is the average size family. So we're talking lots of people. And we had just started working with our Batwa friends. The Batwa are a small tribe in Burundi. And we decided to begin doing human rights advocacy, making sure that they all had identity cards. Most Batwa people are landless, not brought into the system. And so the first thing to get them on track was to get them their own identity cards, proof that they belong here. And so that takes a lot. I mean, right? Think about getting your identity card. We're talking photos and fingerprints and filling out forms. And these are people who've never been to school. So it took a lot of work for our team to come up and help get that many adults into the system. But my husband would go up with the team like twice a week. And he would notice that every time he was up there, there would be a funeral procession, a small little procession every time. And as he started paying more attention in the next week, he noticed that the caskets were really tiny. These were not adults that were being buried. These were tiny caskets. So about the third week, he left the group, his team, and he followed the procession to a little makeshift cemetery that they had. Lots of little tiny crosses. And after they were done with their little service, he sat with mostly mothers, and they told him about all the different crosses, all the different babies and mamas that had died. See, this is what poverty looks like. Because of malnourishment and lack of health care and lack of clean water, mothers and mainly children were not surviving childbirth. And he realized, man, we maybe need to rethink how we're proceeding to make sure that we're trying to help. I mean, we were early on in the process. I mean, we didn't have any health clinics or anything yet, but he's like, maybe we should put the mothers first. Maybe the mothers should get their ID cards first so that they can then get the government health care. He started thinking a little bit differently based on his time. But when he told me this by the time I heard this story, he came home and we were talking about the women, something clicked for me. Something came into focus. So now I'm going to take you into the Isaiah text. So Isaiah is a big book. It was not written by one man, and it wasn't written all at once. So for any of you out there who do biblical studies, it was written by Isaiah, and then probably in subsequent seasons, some of his disciples and community members over hundreds of years. So scholars will talk about Isaiah in three parts: first, second, and third Isaiah. First Isaiah 1 to 39, talks about the loss of the city, and the city is Jerusalem. When we read chapters 1 to 39, the prophet Isaiah tells us the ways in which Jerusalem was coming apart. It was falling apart due to greed, corruption, and all manner of injustice. It's like you could just see the fissures in the city. This urban economy was coming undone. The Assyrians would come in and attack Jerusalem. And by chapter 39, we're told that the Babylonians are on the horizon and that the Babylonians will come in and destroy the city, destroy the temple, and will take people away in captivity. So it's a pretty dismal part of the story. But what we get when we read those chapters is a catalog of loss. This is the way in which the city isn't working well. This is a way in which the structures and the systems aren't serving the community well. The economy, the healthcare apparatus, food security, these things are not working well. And we can see it in the forms of greed, corruption, and injustice. But when you come to the end of chapter 39, before you turn the page to chapter 40, you have to recognize that there are about 100 to 130 years between Isaiah 39 and Isaiah 40. But what happens in that span of time is that the book of Lamentations was written. Now, the book of Lamentations is 5 poems about grief, graphic, gut-wrenching grief, unrelenting grief. My favorite Old Testament scholar, Walter Brueggemann, calls this the grief work of the Old Testament. And they're lamenting the destruction of the city when Babylon came in 587 BCE and did, in fact, destroy the city, destroyed the temple, took away all the elites, the government functionaries, the celebrities, the popular crowd. All of them were carted off to Babylon and just left a burned out city, and all the riffraff, all the have-nots were all left behind. And so Lamentations is the grief work, the expression of loss. My God, what happened? We have lost our entire way of life. You can think of 587 BC like the 9/11 of the Old Testament. And so here was their poetry responding to losing everything. And one of the drum beats, as a matter of fact, this phrase happens about 7 or 8 times in the first chapter of Lamentations. None to comfort. There is none to comfort, none to comfort, none to comfort. There's nobody to bear witness to our grief. There's nobody to comfort us. Nobody cares, nobody sees, nobody understands. We are lost and we are invisible. And there is barely a word of hope in those 5 poems. Their losses and their grief is so deep. It is that deep expression of pathos, of emotion. But then we get to Isaiah 40. So second Isaiah, probably written by disciples and followers of Isaiah the prophet, is Isaiah 40 to 55. And it begins, comfort, comfort my people. Tell them that it's time to come home. It's like a direct answer to the deep grief that we hear in Lamentations. You say that there's no one to comfort you, but I'm telling you, comfort has come at long last. The social situation, the political situation in Babylon had changed. Of course, Caesar's leaders, kings come and go. And there had been enough of a change that God was able to bring them home, to repatriate the Israelites. I mean, of course, remember, they had been living there. They had started families there. But now they get to come home to Jerusalem. And so here we get some of the most beautiful poetry in the entire Old Testament, as far as I'm concerned. I remember growing up singing songs, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, right? Or the trees of the hills will clap their hands. Well, that's all in response to the news that we get to come home. The trees are clapping their hands because they see the Jews coming home to Jerusalem. It's a celebration. It's a return. It is hope. This is what hope looks like. And then we move on to the final part of Isaiah, third Isaiah, which is Isaiah 56 to 66. The hard work of rebuilding the city. This is where Isaiah gives us a vision for the new city, for the new Jerusalem. And he talks about this is a conversation about what could the new city look like. And it begins early on with God saying, do justice. The old city was falling apart because of injustice. The cornerstone of the new city has to be do justice. And from that place of doing justice, we can talk about healthcare policy and worship and a better economy, but it all has to be founded on justice. So this is a big sweep. But if I were to summarize it in 4 chapters, 4 headings, we're looking at loss, lament, hope, and hard work. This is the arc that we get from the old city to the new. So remember, I told you about my husband who spent a good amount of time weeping with women who had lost everything in a marketplace fire, women who had lost everything in a flood, women who were burying their children or their neighbors' children due to poverty and all the injustices associated with it. There was something about watching my husband sit with the women where what finally clicked for me was that he was entering into lament. He was entering into the pathos of these women or these communities, because often women are the ones that go first when it comes to putting those raw emotions out there. Even in Lamentations, what we see is the daughter of Zion. The speaker is personified as a woman listing her grief. So what clicked for me was that he goes to the places of deep pain in these communities, and he sits and he bears witness to their loss. He doesn't argue it away. He doesn't try and tell them, oh, don't worry, it's going to get better. He listens. He bears witness. He weeps with them. He absorbs the pain that they are experiencing. Now, this isn't necessarily a strategy, certainly not a formula. I'm not telling you that if you weep with people, you're going to have a solution for them on the other side. And yet, somehow it is a pattern. And somehow we see it in Scripture. There is something that happens, and right now I'm just going to focus in. Like I said, we have loss and lament and hope and hard work. I want to look at the kernel, which is lament and hope. You know, sometimes we talk about hope like it's a wish. I hope things will get better, right? Recently, I was with Barbara Brown Taylor, and she was saying, you know, there's hope. We often think of anticipatory hope, you know, anticipating that things will be better, like putting on our ruby slippers. But she said, really, hope is participatory. It's like putting on your cleats, lacing up and getting ready to run a race. And that, to me, names the kind of hope that we see in Isaiah, right? That we're going to have to do some things. Hope is new ideas. It's energy, gathering up energy to do something new in response to the loss and lament. But here's the thing. In my mind, it's like a match. You know, when you have a match, it has to strike against something. What I've learned from Isaiah and from our work is that the suitable substance for that match of hope is lament. And there was something that when my husband kept going and sitting with the women, hope, something, his lament with those women, it was the suitable substance that the Spirit was able to use to generate new ideas, new initiatives, new possibilities, things that wouldn't have come about had he not been in that space. So, these women who cried at the end of their business when the marketplace was gone, when he sat with them, I remember him coming home later that day and we were talking and I said, well, Jubilee means we should just forgive their debts. And he's like, well, I'm a banker. If I do that, I will lose my credentials with the central bank. So we have to think of another way to do it without losing, right? So the realities of doing development. So when we leaned into the text, we're like, well, wait a minute. Part of the Jubilee imperative is that nobody should be permanently locked in poverty. That's why every 50 years, there was this recalibration of society. It's like God knew that the rough and tumble of the economy, every 50 years, things happen. You have a bad harvest or somebody dies and you lose your breadwinner. But every 50 years, people should get a chance to get back into the economy. Nobody should be permanently locked out. And so we realized, Jubilee means we should work really hard to get all of those women and everybody else in our community back into the economy. And so for the next 4 months, that's what they did. All hands on deck, everybody that worked in our bank, all of the people, hundreds of our people, not just those women, but other people lost too, right? They just worked really hard to get them all back in. One-on-one meetings, loan officers, individual plans. Do you need longer to repay your loan? Do you need a fresh infusion of cash to bring in more? What do you need to help get you back in? 4 months later, all of our people were back in the economy in one way or another. And we had to have our friends in Texas help support us with an infusion of capital. We had other friends locally who helped do fundraising for some of the most at-risk lenders to raise collateral. We had, we just did everything we could to get these people back into the economy. And while we were doing that, the thing that we weren't paying attention to really was the front door. We still had, a bank branch. What happened is we got 800 new members. It was like this odd thing where our bank actually grew because people were like, I want to be part of that. I want to be part of a bank that didn't close their doors like so many others, but who worked harder because they wanted us all back in the economy and they believed in us. And so there, in an odd way, that marketplace fire, and what happened allowed God to grow something in us in terms of our understanding of Jubilee, of economy, of what we were meant to be doing in Burundi with these families. Now we've had the bank for many years. We have over 40,000 members, 8 bank branches. We're opening up another one this year. The good work continues, creating, support for business people in Burundi. So that's right. The families that lost everything in the flood, not only did we end up having a camp for the displaced, but in conversation with these women and in conversation with some of our friends in Texas, we were able to rebuild an entire neighborhood of 70 homes. We kind of took on the project. And over the next year and a half, we rebuilt 70 homes from the ground up, good foundations, working with really good contractors and engineers and architects, good homes. That now when it rains in Burundi, we never worry about Katumba. We know that they're safe. We know that they're not going to slide down the mountain. But that wasn't part of our plan. But there again, that match was struck because my husband was willing to sit and cry with these folks. And when he drove away, like I said, he had no idea. He's like, I don't know how we help them. Do we try and raise money for food for them? He had no idea. What ended up becoming a neighborhood revitalization program. And for those little tiny caskets, as I told you, we were beginning work in this community, Bubanza. And so all the women, we made sure the women got their ID cards first so that they could then go and get health care. And we started working on birth certificates for all the most sick babies, prioritizing them so that they could go with their mamas and get health care. And over the next set of years, We ended up building a school and a health clinic and had a feeding program with fortified porridge. And every time we would do these things, we would always bear in mind how we could support women and the youngest children. If there was a feeding program, well, let's make sure that the pregnant ladies and the lactating mamas and the little kids get to go in with the students and eat. Or if we have a health clinic that serves the school, but of course we're going to make sure that the nurse has some time for all of these mamas, right? I mean, it was one of those things where just little by little we wanted to be aware. I mean, maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates in Burundi, again, terrible. But we just little by little kept at it. And I remember one afternoon, or morning rather, I was sitting with our head nurse, Lydia, and we were going over the monthly numbers because I was writing a report for our friends in the US. And she's like, "Oh, we didn't lose any babies this month. No babies died this month." And then I saw her flipping back. She's like, "Kelley, we haven't lost any babies in a year. 12 months. We haven't lost a single baby in 12 months. And then she flipped back again. "We haven't lost any women. We haven't lost any mothers in childbirth in the last." We started weeping. I ran upstairs to my husband's office and I said, "You are not going to believe this. In the last year, no babies have died in Bubanza. No mothers have died." We glimpsed the new city where babies don't die. It's one of the things that Isaiah says that happens in the new city is that babies don't die prematurely. And I was like, we are glimpsing the new city where babies don't die too soon because of the injustices of the system. It took us 5 years. But very seldom do we lose a baby or a mama in Bubanza anymore. Very seldom, because we have infrastructure to give them clean water and fortified porridge and health care and all the things that help them thrive, because there's a little glimpse of the new city. There's a little foretaste of it when you go into Bubanza now. And I share this with you because I think for those of us who do long-term work, I found that a lot of people over the years didn't have a unifying theory, a unifying theory of the case. I guess as somebody who is a thinker and a theologian, I'm always looking for that. But I would talk to friends I have friends who work in Haiti and they do maternal health care. And I remember asking, what is kind of your toehold? What is the verse or how do you theologically understand your work? And they gave me a verse about peace. Making peace. And I'm like, it's a beautiful verse out of Corinthians about peacekeeping. But how does that connect with your work in the maternity ward? And I found that happening as I would talk to different people who were working to rehabilitate women in the red light district in Rwanda, or we were talking to people who were dealing with HIV/AIDS in the slums in Kenya. There was this inability to there wasn't this larger understanding for what is the theology that undergirds our work? And for us, over the last 12 years, this has become our theory of the case, theologically speaking, is that we want to rebuild the old city that was riddled with injustice, right? That we want to convert the old city of injustice to the new city that's founded on justice. So a lot of people do the work of conversion, right? You've probably heard lots of stories about missionaries who go across the world and they are saving souls for Jesus. But when you're doing community development work, you're dealing with the stuff of life. In the sense that you're dealing with agriculture and human rights and economies and wells and food, right? We don't have a discipleship program. We do development work. But this is what we are doing. We are converting the city from the unjust society to a just society. That is our call as development practitioners. And When we understand that we are going from loss to lament to hope and to hard work, that has helped us for the last set of years, especially in the last 4 to 5 years once we named it. Because what we see is that we kind of keep going back and forth. It's not like once you get to hard work, that's it. Sometimes you cycle back to lament because bad things happen. This has been a hard year. Coronavirus hit Burundi. We had the unexpected death of our long-term president, and so there was political upheaval. Our economy in Burundi is in free fall. You cycle back to having to re-articulate the loss, what systems aren't working, what injustices are getting in the way of our work and the healthy life of the people here, the families here. There is fresh grief to process, but there's also the fresh work of the Spirit to create new ideas, new hope, new things to do, and then much hard work. And so I give this to you as people who are also engaged in long-term work, whether it's pastoring a community, whether it's you're a social worker working in your community, you are a educator who's getting people all the way through elementary school, or you're getting them all the way through university. We're doing long-term work. We're not doing sprints in a couple of months. We're doing long-term, multi-year work. And this has helped us to have a long-term vision of understanding this is, the reality, loss and lament are the realities that we name. On the other side of the arc, hope and hard work, that's us trying to lean into a new reality, to imagine and embody a new reality. That's what we're doing. Whether you're doing it as a pastor or an educator or a medical professional, this is the work that we do. And Isaiah and Lamentations become deep theological resources for us. And I have found all the other little verses, come on. You can just tell that I love the Old Testament, I guess. But all the other verses somehow fit into this structure for us. And so I know I'm right at the edge of my time, but this is what funds our work. This is kind of the best theological foundation that we have found to articulate the theology of our long-term development work in Burundi. And I think that it tracks with the long-term work that we're doing here too. You guys can ask more questions or you can challenge that, but this is my gift to you, is Isaiah and Lamentations as a way for us to talk about and understand the long-term work of transforming broken cities into ones that are just ringing with justice and goodness for the families and communities that live there.